You're all very brave. You're here for the last session on a Friday afternoon. And so thank you so much for being here. And also thank you so much to the online audience who are also still participating in the last session of this conference on global finance and geopolitical fragmentation. This last session is hopefully, but we shall see, a bit more positive than perhaps the global narratives that we've heard in yesterday's and today's keynote, where, of course, the discussion was focused a bit more on development finance as such, so particularly the sort of the aid and concessional finance aspects of this, and at a global level. So we were faced with challenges to the aid system, fundamental challenges perhaps, but we shall see how it's going to develop further. But here, in this session, we'd like to think about and discuss what are the regional responses, sort of regional level, and so faced with geopolitical fragmentation, what is the response from the regions, and it will be interesting to sort of see how regions are responding with respect to regional infrastructure investment initiatives, with regional payment systems, with regional other initiatives, etc. And it follows also nicely on a session that I actually also moderated here in this room 2 months ago on the area of trade. And I think there were also there was a discussion on geoeconomics, trade and development. And I think we came out in a positive sense, that there were lots of initiatives. So I want to hear whether that's also the case in the area of finance, whether we can sort of discern some responses, and whether it is also in response to geopolitical fragmentation. So we'll have speakers from regions that cover the whole world. I'm very pleased, and also high caliber speakers as well. So let me just run through the speakers that we have for this final session. First of all, we have Dr. Ganeshan Vighnaraya, who is a visiting senior fellow at ODI Global, and a close collaborator with us, particularly in his work on Sri Lanka. But he's also been at the Asian Development Bank as an advisor and at ADBI, working on regional issues in Asia. And so he will be talking to us on an Asian perspective. We'll then turn to Alexander Plekhanov, who is from the EBRD and the Director for Transition Impact and Global Economics and Office of the Chief Economist. And so he'll be talking about EBRD regions. And of course, up until recently, that was more like Central Europe and Central Asia. And of course, there's now an added region, which is Africa. But I think you're talking more about the Asian side and thinking about experiences from the EBRD. We'll then go to the other side, at least of the world, and think about Latin America. And we're very pleased that Minister Council Felipe Bandeira Melo from the Embassy of Brazil is here. And he'll be talking about regional initiatives in Latin America, but also, of course, they're a crucial member of the BRICS countries, and it would also be very interesting to hear from him on any BRICS initiatives that are taking place, either sort of autonomously or perhaps as a response to the geopolitical fragmentation. Then we'll go to Purva Karkara. She's a senior policy analyst at ECDPM, and here we will talk about African experiences, the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also others, and hear how Africa is emerging in the finance space. And then finally, we're very pleased also to have someone from SOAS, the co-organizer, of course. Professor Uli Volz is a professor of economics and the director of the Center for Sustainable Finance at SOAS University of London. And in the past, he's also done a lot of work on regional monetary initiatives in Asia, but he's now covering the whole world with lots of areas. So perhaps he can discuss the potential for regional initiatives. in the context of geopolitical fragmentation in the area of finance, and drawing on his experience from Asia and elsewhere. So what we'll do is we talk for about 5 to 7 minutes each. So each panelist gets about 5 to 7 minutes. And so there's 5 panelists, get different views from different regions. And then I'll bring in the audience and then have a discussion on what we think about these initiatives. Are they adding up? Are they constitute a very good response? Are there any worries with this, or is this a very promising way forward? Right, that's my introduction. Let me then sort of hand over to the first speaker. So Ganesh, could you give us a bit of an overview on the regional finance initiatives, in particular in the area of infrastructure, I think, so the infrastructure investment initiatives, and perhaps given our work in Sri Lanka, it would also be interesting to see how these regional initiatives play out at the country level, right? So how can a country like Sri Lanka, for example, benefit from these?
Sure. Thank you very much, Dirk. As probably all of you know, infrastructure and investment in such is really one of the key drivers of the Asian miracle in East Asia, alongside outward orientation and investment in human capital. Now, the interesting issue is in this era of messy geopolitics, kind of what has sort of happened in this interesting space. And I'm going to talk about 2 things. One is what I call mega infrastructure investment initiatives. China's BRI, which you have heard a bit about yesterday, but I'm also going to talk about the US Indo-Pacific strategy in the context of the new administration, and particularly a private sector-oriented DFC, Development Finance Corporation, and how this sort of has contributed to more fragmented infrastructure finance landscape in Asia. And secondly, I'm going to draw a bit about what this has meant in the Sri Lankan context, which is in recovery mode from a terrible debt crisis and economic crisis. And there's a published paper in a journal and also in the Edward Elgar Companion on the Asian Development Bank, if you're interested in this, and also our report on sustaining transformative growth in Sri Lanka, which is available outside. So the first subject really is about this mega infrastructure investment initiatives. And the key fact here is that Asia has this very large unmet infrastructure gap, which is there. And there are some very interesting numbers that come from defining this as the difference between investment needs and investment levels in Asia, right? And ADB, in a study just a few years ago, talked about a $26 trillion gap between the period 2016 and 30. And so 1.7 trillion is needed per year to maintain growth, eradicate poverty, and respond to climate change. And this is double the estimate that ADB made before, 26 trillion, big number, right? And a simple story suggests there's a huge gap, right? The second is because of this huge opportunity in Asia, you know, the world's fastest growing region, particularly 5, 6, 7%, these dizzy numbers over the last year, has seen many initiatives coming into play backed by major powers, right? So you've got China's BRI, somewhere between 340 billion to 1 trillion is the number that has been put out in this committed money. You've got Japan's partnership for quality infrastructure and the enhanced partnership, $200 billion. The US Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy committed something like 70 billion upwards. And the DFC, which is very private sector oriented, now with the Trump reform of aid finance and the shutting of USAID, has got more powerful in this, right? And it's a much more group thing. And then you have the EU that have the strategy of connecting Europe and Asia, around 140 billion. And there's this new IMAC, India, Middle East, Europe corridor. And then you have the ASEAN infrastructure initiative. And so there are many of these things which are competing now. Now, these vary a lot in their scope and their coverage, but these tend to have tied aid elements, and they're driven by various interests. But there are 2 big challenges with these. The first is, even if you add all of these together, they make a very small dent in the infrastructure investment gap, right? About $100 billion if you add all this a year, right? And remember, 1.7 trillion a year. So that's a big number in which this doesn't make so much difference. And then the second big challenge conceptually is that we think that they lead to a new Asian noodle bowl or spaghetti bowl of multiple overlapping initiatives, which massively raise transaction costs for recipient countries, okay? Now, some of these are better designed than others, and we can talk about this in the chat. And they have common differences as well as attributes. But the entangled noodle bowl idea, and I have a nice little picture in the book, and also we go into much more detail, comes from the packaging of scarce finance by both recipients and donors on different terms and conditions. Intense selling by some bidders and particularly unsolicited projects causes a problem. So you have white elephant projects that can come, and they pose economic risks to participating countries such as Sri Lanka. And there are winners and losers that come from this. So there is this kind of real complexity in the landscape. And poor countries with less capacity are more vulnerable to these things. So in some ways, there is a literature that talks about a predatory set of initiatives and so on. I think that's overstating the case. But the confusion and the lack of coordination and the multiple terms and poor capacity comes in, right? So this noodle bowl is a very important conceptual idea. Second, let me very briefly talk about Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka defaulted on its foreign debt in 2022 and is now beginning to see a cyclical recovery pattern. And if you want to see all about it, you can read our report. And there's another report outside. We did this with ODI. Dirk and I were instrumental with others. And infrastructure investment is critical for Sri Lanka coming into this game. But Sri Lanka sees this messy landscape of these MIIAs playing out on the Sri Lankan's debt story, and we're seeing noodle bowl effects emerging. So of the MIIAs, China's BRI has been instrumental. It contributed something like 14 billion cumulatively since 2006. And the critics have claimed that part of the debt default is related to this China debt trap in Sri Lanka, and Hambantota Port, a low return project in southern Sri Lanka, is associated with this. And there's a 99-year lease. But the data only suggests this is partially true. Partly because even though China is the biggest creditor to Sri Lanka bilaterally, bulk of Sri Lanka's debt is owed to private creditors, particularly bondholders. And then you see good and bad projects under this initiative, right? And in the recent years, China suspended its financing of infrastructure in Sri Lanka after the default, because Sri Lanka couldn't pay back much of the money, but may come back to this space, particularly in the new BRI, right? There's a green BRI, there's a digital BRI. So I think this is space which China will come, and perhaps with much more private sector-oriented projects with perhaps strong emphasis on returns and better coordination. Now, because China has kind of withdrawn to some extent from this space, India and the UF-funded DFC have come in, but with much smaller financing envelopes. India funded a big railway modernization project and ports in Sri Lanka in the last couple of years. But with conditionality, this would create a much stronger linkage with infrastructure with Sri Lanka. The UFDFC has come in financing a big port project with our largest conglomerate, Adani, and Adani's, India's Adani has been a very controversial player, and DFC have provided guarantees. The ADB and the World Bank are investing smaller envelopes of money, but in customs modernization, but it's probably arguably not enough. The gaps are PPPs to crowd in private funding. Our keynote speaker talked about that. Capital market deepening is terribly important, and MDB cooperation. So in conclusion, infrastructure is critical, and these MIAs have been very important both in Asia as well as in Sri Lanka, but perhaps not enough, right? And there needs to be much more emphasis on policies. And one bit from this report we talk about, one very important thing is that you have to prevent white elephant projects by rigorously applying transparent selection for all projects in a public investment program. So that becomes very important. And anti-corruption is another big aspect of this, right? Because that is there, particularly with unsolicited projects. A second thing which we also talk about is investing in specific trade-related infrastructure projects, which have clear returns based on traffic flows, and those connected to India in the north of Sri Lanka, Palali Airport and the port are ones that we think about because of the 85 kilometers miles with the two countries, and India is growing at 6%. A third very important policy recommendation is investing in DPI, digital public infrastructure, which becomes important, e-government services. At the regional level, there are two important implications that come out. Given the honest broker role, there's a big role for MDBs to step up infrastructure connectivity via guarantees and crowding in private institutional investors and better coordination. And the last point is really that the middle powers like India, Thailand, and Japan should do much more to do regional infrastructure, not just the major powers, right? And that becomes important. And the BIMSTEC master plan for connectivity adopted in 2022 becomes very important to try to scale up. So in conclusion, these initiatives have become much more significant in this fragmentation of finance in infrastructure, which is big bucks, as I pointed out in Asia, and they've had mixed record. And at the country level, you're seeing confusion in the recipient countries, and there's a lot we can do on policy. Thank you, Dirk.
Thanks, Dan. It's very clear, very clear. So lots of initiatives, and every country, major country has a regional initiative associated with it, but it can lead to a noodle ball, and it doesn't meet all the needs, and there may be some challenges with it. But yeah, lots of initiatives. Very, very interesting to hear. Let's now move to Central Asia and Eastern Europe. Alex, what do you see as the regional initiatives emerging? What are the prospects for these regional finance initiatives? And are there any barriers to these emerging?
Thank you. Maybe in the spirit of starting discussion on a global note and moving slowly from Asia, I will use much of my opening 5 minutes to maybe connect the discussion to what was said earlier today and to Ganesh's points, and then I can talk a little bit more about European experience. Maybe starting from the same observation as on the morning panel, my first job was at the IMF in Washington. I was also told that it stood for it's mostly fiscal. I was in fiscal department, and so I strongly connect with that notion. But from that notion, the fiscal crunch in developed economies, it's probably not going away anywhere anytime soon. And then that means that we probably will face a period of less ODA, overseas development assistance. And you know, the trade-off between guns and butter may become more stark, and we also talked a lot about it earlier today. If you think that ODA is butter, it's probably not great news for ODA. If you think that ODA is guns, a little bit like in the era of the Cold War, there was some element to that, well, it may be also not great news for the quality of that capital and targeting. So either way, I think this is part of the new normal that we will have to work around. And I promise to finish on a slightly more positive note. It's an important part of the brief. We'll get there. The other observation that I would like to make is that, and that very much ties to spaghetti bowl observation, is probably that global finance has been the most globalized and unified system. Actually, unlike trade, which has a lot of spaghetti bowls in it by design from the start and probably ever more. And Ganesh has written a number of papers on that and others as well. Investment has been fairly fragmented. Most global payments have actually been going through a single unified system that people strongly identify with US dollar, but actually it's SWIFT messaging-based system that is housed in Brussels, as many other things. And then you have basically a very strong dominance of the dollar is actually in a decentralized system. At least until recently, more than 80% of trade has been denominated in dollar, a lot of FDI investment and so on. If you look actually at official moves, the government reserves, not as much. And in fact, the share of the dollar in international reserves bottomed out in 1990 at 50%. That's where the Deutsche Mark kind of was a bit more dominant. So we're actually departing in a payment systems, which Dirk mentioned, from a very globalized system. And yet, in recent months and years, we see a rapid rise of China's yuan as a currency of invoicing in settlement and global trade. And more recently, the rise of yuan as a lending currency as well. So how does one deal with this fragmentation without having the spaghetti bowl? It's probably not a. I'll come back to it later. Now for the positive sense. So despite all these challenges, actually, both the IMF World Economic Outlook and IMF's Global Financial Stability Report that came out at the IMF World Bank meetings just in October had chapters on emerging markets. And both chapters highlighted the resilience of emerging markets, broadly defined, and frontier economies relative to what people expected at the start of intensification of trade wars and fragmentation, but also relative to early experiences. And actually, both chapters alluded to a huge contribution of the development of local currency market and local currency financing, and associated with this more robust macroeconomic frameworks, but both have go in common. So one question is how much regional finance can be achieved. And I think the European Union Capital Market Project tells a cautionary tale there about the limit of what is possible, and I can come back to that. But individually, countries, in particular, if the starting point is not a 15,000 people Pacific island, which was a brilliant question earlier, that's a really tough one. But if you start out as a 15 million economy, I think developing a local currency capital market is possible, highly beneficial, even abstracting from where it's a fixed exchange rate or a local exchange rate. And we as a BRD have done a lot of work there and continue in that direction. I think I'm out of my 7 minutes. I'll stop there and we'll be happy to pick up on these points later.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting about how, you see global finance as being finance being very global and now being fragmented potentially, which may be a challenge, but also a lot of optimism about local currencies and regional initiatives. Thanks, Alex. So now let's move to the Minister Councillor. And Philippe, thank you so much for joining us. It would be great to hear your views on the prospects for regional initiatives in the area of finance and what has already emerged, both in terms of Latin America, but also we'd like to learn also a bit more on sort of BRICS initiatives in this area. So over to you, Philippe.
Very well. Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be here. It will be a challenge to keep these comments speaking about Brazil, Latin America, and BRICS in such a small period of time. I'll try to be brief, but bear with me if I do exceed a little bit. But it is a pleasure to be here. I thank ODI Global, SOAS, and AERC for being here. Maybe I was not here in the morning sessions, but you probably have mentioned that the world is currently experiencing a period of profound turbulence and uncertainty, and that we are witnessing intensified geopolitical tensions, a proliferation of armed conflicts, rising protectionism, and unilateralism. And all of this brings a little bit of a crisis of multilateralism, marked by the declining effectiveness of international organizations. And then development itself appears to be in crisis. If current trends persist, only 15% of the sustainable development goals will be achieved by 2030. Around half of the goals have been stagnated and 18% have regressed. What explains this? The answer lies largely in financing and international capital flows. Without adequate financing and means of implementation, the 2030 agenda risks remaining a declaration of good intentions with no prospect of fulfillment. There was the 4th Financing for Development Conference held in Seville, as you all know, last June, July. They did achieve a consensus outcome, and it was a clear success amid the crisis of multilateralism. However, the conference did not result in increased resources for development financing. Today, if the poorest countries receive around 200 billion annually in ODA, they pay 7 times that amount in debt service. This represents a negative capital flow from the global south, where capital is scarce and investment needs are immense, to the global north, where capital is abundant. This situation is ethically unacceptable and economically unsustainable. In this context, Brazil has consistently advocated for a comprehensive reform of international financial institutions to better reflect the realities and needs of developing countries, making them more inclusive. This includes revising voting powers structures at the IMF and World Bank, increasing concessional financing, and reducing conditionalities that often hinder access to resources. Brazil also calls for greater transparency and accountability in the governance of these institutions, with stronger representation from the global south. Brazil has also emphasized the need for a fairer global tax architecture, including the taxation of ultra-high net worth individuals and multinational corporations. Besides the traditional IFIs, we need to strengthen the role of the United Nations General Assembly through the Second Committee and the ECOSOC in international economic and financial governance. Although developing countries are at a disadvantage when it comes to voting in the Bretton Woods institutions, we hold a decisive majority when it comes to voting in the United Nations. We also endorse the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation to build a fairer global tax architecture. Its goal is to ensure inclusive representation of all UN members in international tax design. So Brazil holds an unwavering commitment to fostering inclusive and sustainable global governance via dialogue and cooperation. We aim to address pressing global challenges and promote a more equitable international order. Our diplomatic trajectory remains focused on promoting cooperation, as I said, multilateralism, and initiatives that integrate social progress, economic advancement, and environmental sustainability. These are 3 key areas in our view. With this in mind, Brazil's concurrent presidencies of G20 and BRICS in 2024 and 2025 have provided a unique platform to advance these priorities. Under Brazil's leadership, both forums have emphasized the need for inclusive and sustainable financial governance. Brazil has made the fight against hunger and poverty a central pillar of its international agenda, notably through the launch of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty during its G20 presidency. The alliance promotes country-led, multi-partner strategies that integrate social protection, sustainable agriculture, and climate resilience. The aim of the Global Alliance is to give cooperation recipient countries a greater say by identifying their own priorities and choosing the programs they feel are best suited to their national contexts. May I point out that, among others, ODI was a partner of this initiative, having produced the report entitled Financing the Fight Against Poverty and Hunger, Mobilizing Resources for Sustainable Development Goal SDG Reset. The initiative now has grown to over 200 member countries and organizations, signaling a new model of global cooperation. Now to BRICS. Well, BRICS represents approximately half of the world's population, 28% of global GDP in nominal terms, 39% in purchasing power parity, 26% of global trade, and over 60% of the world's energy production. Also responsible for a quarter of the global FDI flows. An expanded BRICS holds out the promise of a South with real influence over the redesign of international order. Brazil's present presidency of the BRICS focused around 3 interconnected pillars: the economic pillar, facilitating trade and investment, innovating in payment systems and promoting financial market interoperability, strengthening coordination on international monetary and financial system reforms, and advancing intra-BRICS dialogue on public-private partnerships, taxation, and customs, and also on taxing ultra-high net worth individuals. The second pillar is the climate. driving new financing mechanisms and innovative instruments to accelerate ecological transformation, promoting accessible and sustainable energy transition, and coordinating efforts ahead of COP30 that is now in Brazil. And the third equally important pillar is the social pillar, mobilizing public and private finance to ensure food security, social protection, and economic opportunity for all. Within BRICS, Brazil has promoted the strengthening of three key instruments. Number one, the New Development Bank, the NDB, which has already approved over $40 billion covering approximately 122 strategic projects in 6 focus areas: clean energy and energy transition, transport infrastructure, water and sanitation, environmental protection, social infrastructure, and digital infrastructure. And the B has issued green bonds to support sustainable projects and has maintained a high credit rating for competitive fundraising. The second initiative is the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, which is a $100 billion liquidity mechanism that provides emergency support to BRICS countries facing balance of payments pressures. Brazil has advocated for its operationalization as a counter-cyclical tool, especially in the face of external blocks and capital flight. And the third, more recent, is the BRICS Multilateral Guarantee Mechanism, BMG, a recent initiative aimed at reducing the cost of capital for infrastructure and climate-related investments. By pooling sovereign guarantees and risk-sharing instruments, the BMG seeks to unlock private sector financing and enhance the bankability of strategic projects. Brazil has championed the BMG as a way to address the financing gap in sustainable development, particularly in areas underserved by traditional lenders. These initiatives converge towards a common strategic goal: strengthening the BRICS' collective capacity to mobilize resources, mitigate risks, and act as a dynamic and proactive force in the global economy, prepared to respond to the challenges of sustainable development. A quick note on climate. Well, climate finance has emerged as a central theme in both G20 and BRICS agendas, especially in the lead up to COP30, presently hosted by Brazil. In this sense, allow me to mention to you one of the initiatives, which is called the Tropical Forests Forever Facility, TFFF. I hope you hear more and more of these in the coming days, which has been championed by Brazil and other partners, including the UK, which represents an innovative model for long-term financing of forest conservation. It seeks to mobilize resources from public and private sectors to reward countries for preserving tropical forests, aligning climate action with biodiversity protection and sustainable development. The TFFF has gained traction as a scalable and equitable solution to bridge the climate finance gap and was launched yesterday during COP30 with nearly 50 countries already endorsing it. I can comment a little bit more if you want on the questions. Now for the regional component. Well, I can briefly highlight a few innovative regional financial initiatives from Latin America. One such instrument is the Multilateral Compensation and Reciprocal Credit Mechanism. It's a long name. We call it CCR, and it functions under the umbrella of the ALADI, which is Latin America Integration Association. This is a multilateral payment clearing system between member countries' central banks. Bilateral credit lines denominated in US dollars are established between each pair of central banks. Every 4 months, balances are multilaterally compensated and only the outstanding amounts are settled. Another innovation is Mercosur's local currency payment system, which was mentioned that the local payment system is here before me, created in 2008 in Mercosur. It allows countries to trade using their own currencies, avoiding intermediary hard currencies. The system simplifies trade, reduces exchange costs and risks, and facilitates the participation of small and medium-sized enterprises, reduces barriers and favors, in particular, the activities of the mentioned small and medium enterprises. In addition to these mechanisms, Latin America has developed about a robust regional financing institutions that play a critical role in supporting development in the region. The Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, CAF, as known, has become a key source of long-term financing for infrastructure, climate resilience, and social inclusion projects in the region. There is also the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, seated in Washington, which continues to provide technical and financial support for economic integration, innovation, and poverty reduction, as well as the Financial Fund for the Development of the River Plate Basin, FONPLATA. Meanwhile, in Mercosur, we have the FOSEM, which is the Mercosur Structural Convergence Fund, which offers grants to reduce asymmetries among member countries, focusing on infrastructure, institutional strengthening, and social cohesion. On the national level, just a brief comment, Brazil has its own National Bank for Economic and Social Development, BNDES, as we call it, which does play a strategic role in financing industrial development, innovation, and sustainability. It is also very much into the green energy transition and the bonds. We see it as this experience in Brazil is of structuring complex financing operations and mobilizing blended capital markets is valuable reference for other national development banks in Global South. And just to conclude, I think on Brazilian experience also in this financial inclusion, we have the PIX, which is a digital payment method, which I don't know if you have all heard about, but it was launched by the Central Bank of Brazil in 2020. PIX has revolutionized digital transactions in Brazil by offering free, real-time payments 24/7, accessible to individuals and businesses alike. It has put 71 million people into the financial system in Brazil. So I will conclude here and then keep the other comments for later on. Thanks.
It's a fantastic long list of of initiatives, isn't it? And though I think the framing which you brought this was also quite interesting and important for the session, which is that you were using the G20 presidency and the BRICS presidency to advance your global outlook, right? So it's a slightly different way of sort of saying, well, you want to have you want to focus on regional initiatives, but you actually use groupings to advance global initiatives, and which is very, very interesting. But at the same time, I think the BRICS initiative that you mentioned, they are pretty substantial in terms of amounts, and also the payment systems and that you mentioned at the end, Brazil, are very interesting and innovative ways of managing the finance system at the moment. Right, let's now move to Purva, who we're going to ask about initiatives in Africa, and so you've worked on the AFCFTA, but also other issues in Africa, quite a lot at ECDPM, a fellow think tank, so we're interested in your take on what you see is emerging in Africa.
Right. Well, thanks a lot, Dirk, also for inviting me for this webinar. Maybe I will focus a bit more on industrialization and private sector development, and also in a continent that is extremely diverse. Maybe with the starting point, now that we're talking about geopolitics, I think talking about BRICS, it makes a lot of sense. Talking about Asia makes a lot of sense as well, given the size of the continent. I think Africa, in that sense, becomes somewhat of a sleeping giant, because when it comes to Africa, the conversation seems to be quite cornered in development cooperation. And very rightly, it has its critiques. And while the narrative is now changing to saying we need trade and not just aid, the paradoxical situation I find is that, okay, aid flows are going down, but Africa's share in global trade has remained around 6%. It's been quite stagnant, and if anything, it's slightly declining. So increasingly, solutions are also being sought in regional solutions. Regional trade. And this is where the AFCFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, becomes quite interesting. And the Secretariat of the AFCFTA also sees the agreement as a way of embarking on this process of industrialization. So then the next question becomes, okay, what do we need in order to promote intra-regional trade, which we know is more sophisticated than Africa's trade with the rest of the world? So there's a few things that come to mind. So first would be the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System, which sounds quite similar to what you have in Latin America, but maybe it's not as sophisticated yet because it's still being developed. But as of 2025, it does have 19 countries on there and more than 150 banks. So can it still be scaled up? Yes, of course. But I think already having 19 countries that can, in principle, trade with each other without needing to depend on a hard currency is quite an achievement. Another thing that hinders intra-Africa trade is infrastructure. So Ganesh already mentioned the number that was for Asia, which is in the trillions. The number that is very often cited in Africa is actually 100 billion, which I'm suddenly thinking maybe that also is quite an underestimation. But if we're talking about infrastructure, then the African Development Bank becomes quite interesting, and they do have some blended finance tools, because I think this is going to be relevant for all of Africa's population. I don't think passengers make the railway commercially viable, nor do African households are going to make the grid commercially viable, right? You need for that industrial off-takers. And these off-takers, some of them do exist, but they're still emerging. So you have this typical chicken or egg situation as to which one comes first. And that's why you need, in my understanding, that's also why you need this blended finance in order to get some investors in there. Again, these mechanisms have been put in place. There's also an adjustment fund under the AFCFTA, which is being managed by the Afrexim Bank. But I would say for all these funds that do exist, it's a very positive development, but they do need funding in order to scale up and also reach more number of countries. But so this is all focusing on trade. After that, you kind of go to investments, because at the end of the day, you also need access to investments and foreign investments in order to get access to technology, if we're talking about industrialization, and also engage in some kind of learning by doing, which you are able to do if you engage with foreign firms. Even here, Africa's share in global FDI is at around 3%. Under the AFCFTA, again, you have a protocol on investments, which is also quite celebrated because it's not looking only at investor dispute settlement, but also talking about investment promotion and investment facilitation, which I think is quite important. Two buts here. Just having an investment protocol does not mean it has been implemented. And so if we're talking about implementation, we need to think about accompanying measures that will be required, aligning policies across countries, and also implementing the provisions of the protocol. A second but is, even if the protocol was implemented, I don't think investments will naturally follow. And for them to follow, I think we also need to try and understand how industrialization happens and how development happens. And there are some instances from where we can draw lessons. Just in Africa, thinking about the textiles and apparel sector, this is where I have worked a bit. We can draw lessons from Ethiopia in terms of how the Ethiopian government actually managed to convince an investor to make investments in Ethiopia on textiles and apparel. Here, it goes into strategic coordination. You almost think about it in terms of industrial policy, where infrastructure and all other things are a part of it, but of a much bigger package. And not just foreign investment that Ethiopia sought, you also have instances of regional investment happening. So you have South Africa as a regional investor, but even Mauritius. We need to draw lessons in terms of what makes them make investments in other countries, and then try to design our policies that way. So speaking of investments as part of industrial policy, it also takes me to the question of maybe green industrialization. This is what all of us are talking about these days. In Africa, you do have the African Green Industrialization Initiative that has been introduced quite recently, which also has an aspect of investments, and it looks at heavy industries. Even here, linking it back again to industrial policy, I would say it's not just about having an initiative or even putting in place the investment protocol, but actually trying to have that institutional capacity to coordinate, look for financing, and also find anchor investors and anchor demand. Where's the demand going to come from for these things? Just today, I was reading about Namibia's green hydrogen and how that is not really going anywhere, partly because demand projections were a bit too optimistic. So we need to be careful about those things as well. If I have 1 minute, maybe I want to talk about 2 things where I think, maybe 3 things, where more attention needs to be paid if we're talking about financing in Africa, given the current geopolitical situation. First and foremost for me would be, how can we more productively use remittances in Africa, which really amount in the billions of dollars. And this is very important if we're talking in a context of domestic resource mobilization, which is fairly limited because the productive sector is fairly limited at this point in time, and informal economies are very large. Also, domestic debt is not a panacea because interest rates are quite high and there's risks of debt rollovers. Also, we can't be talking only about foreign debt. I mean, this has already been discussed before, so I won't get too much into it. But yeah, given these things, we should think about how to make best use of the resources that Africa does have. Another avenue would probably be to look at sovereign wealth funds, asset management funds, and different kinds of funds that are available, which do amount to quite a bit. And a third thing maybe would be to also look at the global financial architecture and how that can be reformed in a way that also helps African countries. Just a very tiny example there, I was reading the other day that S&P changed their framework. And because of the change in their framework, there's about billions, I mean, I don't know how many billions, but billions of dollars that are going to become free for multilateral lenders, among which the African Development Bank. And I think thinking about risk perceptions and how to change these risk perceptions, because that's what they are. African countries are no more likely to default on their debt than any other. How do we change those perceptions, and what needs to be done in the global financial architecture to change those things? I think those would be the things that I would look at. Maybe I will stop here for now. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Purva. So also very, I would say, positive story about some of the initiatives that are beginning to emerge. Also, payment system, regional payment system, the POPs, and some other mechanisms like the adjustment fund, blended finance, but they haven't reached the full potential yet. So there's still more work needs to be done. And I think also your intervention also touched a lot on sort of the interaction between the real sector and the finance sector, so industrialization, and having good ideas, and sort of finishing with your Namibia example, or mentioning your Namibia example. So if the project doesn't make sense, then you don't get the finance. So it's important to make sure that the projects do make sense, and that there are good projects. But maybe there is a positive story there for Africa as well, because sub-Saharan Africa is expected to grow at 4.3% next year, and one of the fastest growing regions in the world in terms of expectations there. So thanks so much. So now let's go to the final panelist. So Uli, I mean, I've known you for quite some time, and I think at the beginning when you were working a lot on regional capital markets in Asia, but now you're very visible in a number of global debates. So maybe from your point of view, so looking at all regions, what do you think are the prospects for regional initiatives? And you can of course draw on your Asian experiences. Over to you, Uli.
Yeah, hello, and thanks a lot, Dirk, and many thanks for having me. And I regret I can't be with you in person. Well, I've been indeed kind of an ardent promoter of regional cooperation, economic and financial cooperation. But I think this is becoming an ever more important issue with the current geopolitical environment, where, I mean, at least in some areas, we have, I think, a breakdown of global economic governance. So while we definitely need to try to keep up or kind of rebuild global economic cooperation governance, I think there is a very strong role for regional cooperation. I think the Asian region, and in particular East Asia, provides some very interesting insights when it comes to regional financial collaboration. And I'd like to highlight 3 points. The first one is regional financial cooperation is really important, especially if regions are tightly integrated in terms of trade. And that was clearly the case in East Asia. But when the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98 hit the region, it was utterly unprepared to really deal with a regional financial crisis, because what we saw was that there was very quick spillover effects, financial contagion from one country to others. So initially it was only Thailand, but then quickly the crisis spread across regions. And at the time, the international response led by the IMF and also the World Bank was really not up for the task. And so it became very clear that the region didn't really have any kind of self-defense mechanism. So countries were left alone, and they had no established ways of helping each other. And so better regional collaboration arguably would have prevented some of the worst effects of the Asian financial crisis. And so what happened then after the Asian crisis was that the ASEAN countries, so the 10 Southeast Asian countries at the time, and China, Japan, and South Korea got together in the so-called ASEAN +3 grouping, and then gradually developed a regional financial architecture. So starting to develop a regional financial safety net with the so-called Chiang Mai initiative, so with kind of swap arrangements. And we've seen quite a lot happening since then. We've seen the establishment of AMRO, the ASEAN +3 Market Research Office, which is a kind of regional IMF, sort of. And so there's quite strong collaboration now on macroeconomic financial issues among these countries. Of course, not everything is going without frictions, but the region is much better prepared now to deal with issues of financial instability. And I think there's a strong case to further advance this, to turn AMRO, Chiang Mai Initiative, multilateralization into a real full-fledged regional monetary fund complementing the IMF, not working against the IMF. So I think this is really something that needs to be advanced. The global financial safety net is still very sketchy. We do have these regional financial arrangements in a number of regions, but the biggest gap is in Africa, and that's clearly, I mean, this has been, of course, discussed. There is actually a plan for an African regional financing arrangement that has been on the table for a long time, but countries haven't really advanced with it. But I think that is something that should be advanced, because we see that also with the biggest shareholder of the IMF, you know, kind of exerting its influence at the fund, that you know, it's risky to rely only on that institution, even though I would very much argue we need a strong global IMF. The second area I want to highlight, and that also was a direct lesson from the Asian financial crisis, is that regional cooperation can play a really important role in developing local currency bond markets. And so one of the major problems that led to the Asian crisis was that there was a lack of lack of long-term local currency financing opportunities in the later crisis countries. So there was a lot of cross-border borrowing, often short-term and in dollars. So there was a kind of double mismatch problem that then led to the Asian crisis. And so one of the big lessons was countries need to try to develop local currency bond markets. And there were concerted efforts at the regional level. very much supported by the Asian Development Bank, to develop these local currency bond markets, and that extended to developing appropriate regulatory frameworks. Also, you don't have to reinvent the wheel in every country. So, trying also to have certain standards and harmonization across the region, making it easier for also international investors to come in, so that they don't have to deal with hundreds of different standards. And this has been a tremendous success. So to anyone who's saying, oh, kind of mobilizing domestic capital and developing local bond markets and all that, that's a really long-term agenda. Of course, it's not an agenda that you can complete overnight, but I would say that has been a tremendous area of success that we've seen in Asia, and other regions really can learn a lot from that and also replicate that. And especially, of course, Africa, where capital markets are still very much underdeveloped. And I mean, although one should say there has been also, at least in some parts of Africa, quite remarkable growth in local currency bond markets as well. But I think having regional cooperation can really foster this agenda. And then the last point I want to highlight, where I think we can also draw important lessons from Asia, and especially East Asia again, is the role of domestic financial resource mobilization and also the role of public financial institutions. And so obviously we're living now in a world where ODA is shrinking. We need more international climate finance, but again, we're not really seeing it grow. So attention has been shifting more towards domestic financial resource mobilization. And while I would, of course, maintain that we do need more international public finance, I've always been highlighting that at the end of the day, the only way to really advance development is through domestic financial resource mobilization, and mobilizing domestic savings, building a local financial system that can really create credit for productive investment. So in that sense, I think it's actually, at least one positive side to this current debate, that there is a greater focus now on domestic financial resource mobilization. And here, I'd like to highlight that specifically when it comes to the cost of capital problem, this is a problem that really cannot be addressed without domestic financial systems. So everyone is rightly complaining about the high cost of capital that really is a major bottleneck to development, that is stifling investment. But kind of any external efforts can only, will not address the structural problems behind that. So, I mean, it's important to have all these discussions about rating agency biases and so on. But at the end of the day, if countries are not able to mobilize domestic savings in a better way, develop local financial systems that create productive credit, the cost of capital problem will not be addressed. And this brings me back to Asia, where we have seen spectacular development successes. And in each of them, domestic financial resource mobilization and financial sector development was very much at the center of the developmental strategy. So going back to, say, Japan, which in 1875 established the Postal Savings Bank, copying the Postal Savings Bank, which was invented in Britain just like 15 years before. This was really transformative for Japan to mobilize savings, foster industrialization, and we've seen that replicated in the other success countries in Asia, South Korea, with the Korea Development Bank, very much followed the Japanese model. In Singapore, after independence, the Central Provident Fund played a key role of mobilizing savings from the working population to invest in public infrastructure, housing, and so on. China, of course, you can't talk about development without looking at the role of public development banks. And so I think we are now at a point where, luckily, the discourse around role of national development banks is shifting. So in the 1980s and 1990s and also 2000s, public development banks were often seen as, things of the past, badly governed institutions that really will not help development, but rather hinder it. Now with Finance in Common, we have a much more substantive discussion, which also recognizes that well-governed public financial institutions can really play a critical role. And so I think we have a lot of great examples from Asia, so this. I think we really need to have much more focused discussion on local financial market development, local capital, especially bond market development, and local currency financing, because the vast amount of investment that we need for fostering sustainable development, for fostering climate investment, has to be in local currency. And foreign currency lending in a way is actually contributing to the problem. If this is the major source of finance, because then it really creates FX risk, it creates dependence on foreign capital, so that actually increases macroeconomic risk and cost of capital. I'll leave it here, but I think there's a lot of positive stories that we can actually take from Asia, and lessons that fitted to the local context can help countries design better financial and developmental policies. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Oli. Thank you for these positive learnings from Asia. So that brings us to the end of the panelists' contributions, and I want to bring in the audience. And whilst you're thinking about your questions, I think it's interesting to sort of see, well, first of all, we can sort of observe that there are lots of regional initiatives emerging, and there are lots of examples in different regions, and some are more advanced than others, some are bigger than others, and they have different characteristics, and they serve different purposes, and so on. And I think that is, yeah, we probably need to sort of characterize that a bit more, and analyze those. But I think the second point is then the so what. So if this is in a response to geopolitical fragmentation, or this is just emerging, is this a good thing or not? And maybe also it will be interesting to see whether the audience has any questions on that. But I mean, I heard three different things in the panel. So I think that from Ganesh, you were highlighting a lot of different initiatives, but you also pointed to the noodle bowl, the spaghetti noodle bowl, as it were. So there may also be some challenges out there, and wouldn't it be better to have a global system? I've also heard from Uli sort of saying it's essential that there need to be regional financial systems, for example, for financial resilience, safety net. So Asia didn't have one when the Asia financial crisis hit. It does need one, and it's been building on this, building one, and every region should have one, perhaps, because in the future you may not be able to rely on multilateral institutions, and you need to have friends, and maybe in the region you have your friends. Question mark. Then there's something in between, and I think I've also heard that is that regional initiatives are stepping stones, and they lead you to the global outlook or to local outcomes. So in the case of Philippe, for example, sort of using the regional and groupings to reach your global outlook, sort of an idealistic outlook there, I think is definitely one way to look at these initiatives. And then Uli was talking about regional initiatives that they really had good impacts locally on local bond markets development. So there was some success stories out there that were done through the regional lens. And it doesn't mean that you can't do those through a multilateral lens, but at least there were some positive stories out there. So then it's the instrumental view. So you may have an idealistic view or an instrumental view. And it would be interesting just to also hear the panel's thought on that. But are there any questions that come in that you want to bring up and answer to the panelists? Bernardo, and then over there.
Thank you very much. Couple of questions, if I may, to the Minister Chancellor. You kind of anticipated this question, but this tropical forests for facility has been announced for some days now. But I was curious more on the mechanics of it. I mean, there has been some general announcements of how it's going to work. But I understand it's going to be a mix of private and public funds, kind of invest them and then use the revenues from these funds. But I was interested also in the mechanics of the fund and also how to be more inclusive on it, because even if you, as you mentioned, the UK has been also partner of the fund, but as of yesterday, I don't know if yesterday that things changed, but as of yesterday, the UK didn't contribute to it financially. And even if the UK, which is keen to contribute to it, how can we ensure that more countries or join the initiative? Then to Purva, I agree with the point that even when legal instruments are implemented, they are not the main drivers of investment and economic activities. So I was curious from your experience in the intra-African context and for intra-African investment flows, what are the main drivers, on where can we find finances sources, and what can unlock them? And more generally for the panel as well, the country platform for climate finance has been in place for some time. So I don't know if there are lessons learned more general for financial flows, because we have been talking about the spaghetti bowl. So I think we can also learn some lessons from what we have seen from climate platforms.
Thanks, Bernardo. Gentleman here.
Matteo Cianforlini, University of Bologna. So for the panel, there has been an increasing complexity of multilateral development banks globally, and they increasingly serve countries and member shareholders outside of their region of interest. So for example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been expanding in Africa, not only North Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa, there is also the African Development Bank. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is also financing countries in Africa. The new Development Bank is expected to expand to Egypt. Egypt is already a member, but is expected to finance Egypt as a country. So, of course, this should be in some ways good news, since more funds are available for countries all around the world. But at the same time, is there possibility of having negative effects of it, as it was being said before, increasing fragmentation, competition among those multilateral development banks? Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else at this stage? Yeah, gentleman here.
My question is to Rich Voice. I hope I'm pronouncing your name very well. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody.
Uri.
Good afternoon. I'd like to ask a question about regarding, you spoke about Africa, that initiating bond markets, domestic financial source mobilization, fostering industrialization, empowering national development banks. Does that mean IMF's structural adjustment is out of the window and it doesn't survive in that milieu? That's my question.
All right, thank you. So yeah, some interesting questions. So maybe also, and you may also want to address my points as well. And I think the question about increasing complexity of development finance institutions, increasing the choice that's there, as it were, the different initiatives. Is that a good thing? So everyone may have its advantages, but countries also have to deal with differences. Clearly, one DFI maybe you don't have a lot of choice, but if you've got many, is already some, then it may be a good thing. But if you got many, is that a good thing? So how much fragmentation is good, as it were? Is any fragmentation good? It will be interesting just to hear all the panel's views on that as well, and any other questions that are being posed. Maybe you want to go first, Ganesh? Yeah.
So for sure, having more DFIs is quite useful from a country perspective, I think. But then what you want is really two things. One is you want common diagnostics done by these DFIs. I mean, otherwise what happens is, one DFI comes, spends ages doing project preparation and diagnostic. Another one comes in exactly the same thing for a project. The country is just waiting for the money to come, right, and the project to come, right, and that becomes a big issue. Which is why the BRI was so attractive. They didn't do all this project prep and etc. And they just did the stuff. And of course, the problem was you have good and bad projects, right? So you want much more common working. And that's very difficult because the incentives, the heads of these MDBs meet regularly and they agree on coordination and cooperation and blah, blah. But at the country level, often the incentives are such that the country directors are competing, right? Because their promotions and so on depend on how much project volume they deliver. So there's a real issue, and maybe Alex will have a better sense from how EBRD does it, but that's a problem. The second thing is, all of this money, even if you put all the DFI money in any South Asian country I can think of, it's not enough. So by definition, you need to have all the local bond markets and other things developing. And I think that's a very important area. But whether we need local development banks, there's a real issue of governance, right? And I think that is a perennial problem. Local development banks, and indeed state banks, in many countries have been used by various politicians for nefarious purposes, shall we say, and cronyism. And that's a real issue. And so in East Asia, there was a mix of incentives and punishment, but there was also cronyism. In some of the South Asian countries, it's not been so great. So there's a real issue of governance there. And I think the issue there may be, and we talk about this in our report, is to use the existing banking system where one can and try to have different vehicles, and maybe the MDBs, the international MDBs, being partner of many of these projects. So there is at least some of the standards and governance. So those are cautions as well as opportunities. Thank you.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Alex, on EBRD and the other issue.
I think it's a great observation. One observation is that these are, the multilateral development banks are complex bureaucracies with, I think, useful developed skill sets. They take years to build. They outlive their initial purpose, and this is normal. I think if you take the example of the World Bank, it was established in 1946 as a post-war reconstruction and development bank for infrastructure in a very literate sense. You have to fast forward probably to early 1980s to meet the first references to the environment that are apparently in documents about Brazil, but the World Bank, and then fast forward a bit more to actually find the first poverty discussions. And now we would think of the World Bank as an institution, which is all about poverty and largely about the environment. And I think the same transformations have happened to EBRD over the years. In part, it's probably a testament of some success in the traditional geography of Central Europe, that there is less work to be done there. And there are some, I think, areas of expertise, whether building structures for public-private partnerships, say, or whether working on local currency finance that are transferable, but also complementary. We could maybe work with a government to develop legal frameworks for public-private partnerships, but somebody else will come, like the World Bank, with a chunk of financing, and maybe the International Monetary Fund will come with macro program. Some competition happens between these institutions. Some competition is healthy. Some coordination, as Ganesh said, is healthy. And the last observation is indeed that the needs are huge, and we have our bureaucratic rules. Some of them are quite outdated because they are nominal and have not been updated. For us as an institution, the largest single obligo limit, so the largest amount for a single project, is 500 million euros. Is it a large number? Is it a small number? Well, in a scale of many infrastructure projects, I think, if you look at BRI initiatives in Africa, the largest China investment this year is 20 billion, something like that in Nigeria. So on the scale of 20 billion, you have to collect many institutions with $500 million each to actually get to a number that matters. And maybe if I can comment, maybe 30 seconds on a great point about local currency markets, but also if they are mispriced. Because as we expand to sub-Saharan Africa, actually, internally, there are fascinating discussions between different departments exactly about that question that was asked earlier. Are African countries now more likely to default than other countries at a similar level of development? Is the debt mispriced? And then suppose for a second, abstracting from the merits of the argument, that it were true. So what could you do in a kind of regional financial integration spirit? I think you could come up, as we did, and as was mentioned on a panel, but some kind of risk guarantee instrument. Because if you think that the market is fundamentally mispriced, then you need some kind of umbrella risk guarantee that is available pretty much to anyone who would like to invest in something sensible in local currency. And then it can bring down the cost of that financing, maybe by a couple of percentage points, maybe more. In our experience in Central Asia and emerging Europe, on average, it was mispriced by about a couple of percentage points. So they would charge 18% and the fair rate would be 15, 16, something like that, given history of defaults and depreciations. So if it's actually a guarantee for a good cause, then on average it will not be drawn and actually can be reused indefinitely. And you over time correct that market externality, build the local markets and address the fairness argument in this context. And usually the thing about these fairness arguments is that the truth is somewhere in between. That externality is there, but it's not as large as the other side of the argument will tell you, because an occasional Ghana would occasionally default and remind the community that these defaults are real.
Yeah, yeah. All right, thanks. So thinking about the answer about EBRD and the role it can play, and how different DFIs, development banks, can play different roles. Of course, bearing in mind Ganesh's point that some are governed better than others, but at least in Brazil, the BNDES has been always held up as a very good example. And about 10 years ago, I opened an advisor to the House of Commons inquiry into whether the UK should have a development bank, and we also listened to evidence from the BNDES and the AFD in France. But yeah, the Treasury at that time at least was thinking that capital markets are a more efficient way of raising capitals rather than DFIs. But I think the pendulum may have a bit swung towards DFIs, and as Uli was saying. But bearing in mind we need to draw lessons, and not every bank is local bank is a good one. But over to you, Philippe.
No, thank you for the questions. I think maybe just picking up on the last question, I think the idea of let's say developing countries in general, I mean, the overall objective is developing our economies. I mean, so the more the merrier in a way. So I don't see much of a competition. I think that obviously the traditional Bretton Woods institutions have been there for a long time, and they do have contributed a lot. But there are, let's say, as I have mentioned, questions of representation, and sometimes some projects are not easily accepted due to their, let's say, criteria. And in that sense, since the needs and development needs are still there, or even, let's say, even stronger, these regional development banks have come into place. And that was the case in Latin America. And now more recently, well, now with the 10 years already of age, with the NDB in BRICS. And then coming just quickly to the NDB to give you this example is, I mean, definitely it is not only open to BRICS members, it's open to non-BRICS members. And it does provide a model that is seen to be faster, more flexible in financing with fewer conditionalities. Some of the objectives that have in place of the NDB is the 30% of the lending is in local currencies to mitigate exchange rate risks, 30% to non-sovereign operations for the private sector, 40% to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And in certain projects, there is a co-financement of 20% of projects with other multilateral banks. So there is this convergence as well. And just an additional, I think, objective that the bank has that might be an innovation, hopefully, in the world is to increase female representation to 40% in the professional and managerial positions. So this is also something that the bank is striving to do. I don't know if I should maybe answer the TFFF question as well, or
in 30 seconds.
In 30 seconds. Okay, so very quickly, yes, the TFFF, well, has been launched. It's very new. Many partners are adhering, some already with funds, others, these funds or decisions to be made. But I think it is maybe also the innovation of it is that it's a way of providing a fund, so it's not a donation from countries. So this is already very different from others' donations to preserving the forest. It covers 80 tropical forests countries with 1.2 billion hectares. 20% of payments are earmarked for indigenous people and local communities. They are the traditional stewards of the forests. And the countries retain full autonomy over how funds are used, whether for healthcare, for education, or green infrastructure. So it's not a charity. It's a post-ODA sponsored-based mechanism where all invested capital is returned to the investor. So this is the complete, let's say, innovation in this process. And it is targeted to have $125 billion with an initial goal of raising $10 billion now. And this is where governments are coming in and philanthropies to unlock the further private investments. So we are very enthusiastic with this fund, and hopefully, and I think the logic behind it, just to end, the logic behind it is inverting the logic of these economies that have forests, is that the forest is worth today better dead than alive. So cutting out the forests gives more output. And this is the idea of rendering to the local populations that no, the forest gives them is better alive than dead. So this is the idea behind it.
Thank you. Purva.
Hello. I'll try to be quite brief. On the point of DFIs and what you raised, Dirk, as well, is it better to have one system rather than a fragmented system? Sometimes I feel maybe the whole idea of structure is a bit overrated, because I find one system won't always work for everyone, right? Because there's a lot of diversity in the countries that are available in terms of the sectors that you want to look at. And there's always trade-offs between the different DFIs that you want to work with as well. And I think there's a fundamental difference between having a lot of choice and having to put together pieces because of fragmentation. So we need to see where exactly the situation that we're talking about falls. So that would be like my 2 cents on DFIs. On the idea of PDBs and NDBs, I am very much on the same page as Ulrich here, I would say. I do think it is needed. And to the point of cronyism, I mean, because I work a lot on political economy issues, I think about industrialization from a political economy aspect. I think the question we should be asking ourselves is more, how can we create vested interests in economic development? For me, corruption is, I don't think underdevelopment is because of corruption. I think corruption is a sign of underdevelopment. So if we flip the question, and having grown up in India, having followed China, I do firmly believe that this can be changed and you can create pockets of efficiency. So that's on the governance side. Now to the question on investments and how can we unlock them very quickly. If you look at what happened in Ethiopia or Mauritius, like I mentioned, I mean, I'm happy to have a bilateral with you later. I wouldn't be able to tell you where they got the financing from, the investors. But the point was these countries knew precisely what they were trying to do. The problem had been defined before they went into looking for financing. So that's one way to look at it, which you could say demand-led. Another one, the example I gave of infrastructure and blended finance, I think there we need to look at the problem slightly differently. There maybe it is about the AFDB or any other DFI that's going to look at infrastructure financing in Africa needs to come up with a kind of model which becomes a proof of concept, which convinces other DFIs and other development partners to actually work with the AFDB or whichever model you are working with, rather than creating parallel systems. That is what Ganesh was also saying adds to the transaction costs of countries. And adding to the point that he made, which I do think is very important, the agency of countries, right? Like that you need to have the agency among these countries to say, we need help in terms of X, Y, and Z, where DFIs are coming in to say, we can offer that financing or help in A, B, and C. And then you sit down and talk, where is the sweet spot? And where can you actually make the demand side and the supply side meet together? But I think that, again, asks for coordination. And I do wonder if African countries have that every time. Thanks.
All right, Purva, thanks so much. Ulrich.
Yeah, thank you. A lot of good questions. So maybe first on the MDB issue. I mean, I think competition also between MDBs is not a bad thing. But we've actually seen more recently, I think, more cooperation between MDBs than we've seen ever before, and I think that is good. And there has been now a much larger discussion about MDBs, but not only MDBs, but also public development banks more broadly, working more as a system. And that brings me to the issue around local development banks, national development banks. Well, of course, we've had good ones and bad ones, but that's true also in the private finance sector. I mean, we've also had badly governed private financial institutions, and no one's saying, oh, we should shut down all private financial institutions because there have been badly governed ones. And so I think it's great that as part of the financing common system, there is now really a debate. How can we use the kind of more than 520 public development banks, kind of global, regional, national, to really foster development? And the truth is that a lot of areas where we need investment for sustainable development, also for climate action, they will not generate commercial returns that will be attractive enough for private investors. And importantly, we need really longer term finance. And that is something where public development banks can play a leading role. And very importantly, and that's something that I've been trying to advance, and we've done some work with the German government, for example, and FIX and IDFC. How can we use the might of the MDBs and also leading international development finance institutions like AFD, KfW, to empower national development banks to play a more important role in fostering sustainable development? And I think there is a huge potential. And there is one, so this relates to governance and to technical capacities, but also to the financial side. And let me just emphasize that, or give you an example of Nigeria Development Bank, which is, I think, a really interesting one. So Nigeria, as you will probably all know, is a country that does have significant governance issues, or you can call it corruption. And Nigeria had a number of public development banks, national development banks, that were established after independence, and which, were very much falling into the stereotype of badly governed public financial institutions. So they were super corrupt, a lot of political lending. Of course, their balance sheets were crap. And then the Nigerian government and central bank decided, okay, let's shut them all down. We can't reform them. They are just too bad. But we do need a public development bank. And then they established the Nigeria Development Bank, and they did so with support of international partners. So the Nigeria Development Bank is modeled upon the KfW, AFD, World Bank, European Investment Bank, or supported the establishment. EIB and World Bank actually provided equity capital. The bank has been established from the start with very strong governance standards, and it's been operating now for 10 years. It's a really successful example. It has very high standards regarding hiring of staff at all levels. The Nigerian government has only one seat on the board, and Ghana actually replicated this model with Ghana Development Bank recently, and I think there is a lot we can learn from these kind of examples. And one thing that I think can't be emphasized enough is that public development banks can be actually a wonderful vehicle to mobilize private capital. And this is exactly the model of the MDBs, right? I mean, the World Bank and the ADB and the African Development Bank and the others, they have received capital from their shareholders. Thanks to the good standing of the major shareholders, they have a very good rating. And then that enables them to issue bonds in international capital markets and raise capital at very low cost. And we basically need to enable national development banks to have exactly the same model, helping to mobilize domestic savings, mobilizing private capital, but local currency, and then really fostering local development finance. So I think there's a huge potential, and this is now getting recognized. And of course, we need to be careful with governance. And as I said, the bad public development banks, if they can't be reformed, they should be shut down. And then very final point, there was a question about, so what about structural assessment programs? Are they a thing of the past? Well, I mean, the IMF has also changed over time. Of course, we still have, more traditional kind of austerity packages and so on. But the fund, for example, does recognize the important role of public development banks in mobilizing capital and so on. So I think we are in a new world in that sense. And it's not only the discussion about public development banking, also industrial policy. I mean, think back 10 years ago, who was talking about industrial policy? It's a very different discourse, and just like with public development banks, people have recognized that industrial policy is not that kind of caricature that was made of it. It's not just like picking the winners and then supporting your cronies and whatever. Smart industrial policy can really be a great part of development, but you really need to have a broader developmental strategy where you have the right macro policies, the right kind of industrial sector policies, of course, educational research policies, and also the right financial sector policies. And it needs to be like one strategy that fits together. And all of that very much has to enable private enterprise. So it should not be about just having public enterprise, and advocating for a stronger role of public development banks doesn't mean that we don't need a stronger kind of strong private financial institutions. Anyway, I'll stop it here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ulrich. I think in your answer you've also answered a question that came in online, which was around how international financial institutions can help local populations if they're not as close to the local populations. And I think you mentioned sort of through national development banks. So maybe that brings us to the end of the session because we're slightly overrunning now as well. This was a very interesting session, and I think it's on a topical issue. It was a very broad issue, and but I think what it does do is it does highlight the importance of regional initiatives, and there's lots of that around. There are lots of them around, but we need to analyze them. We need to think much more on these. And is it a good thing? How do they reach? What happens at country level? So it's like in Sri Lanka, for example. How do all these initiatives convert into an impact at country level? And that's a sort of a rich research agenda for people who are interested in development finance, but in finance more generally, is around thinking about what's going on now, which and analyzing that is a tall order because it's happening now. But then thinking about a longer term research agenda behind this, I think is also going to be really important, including for SOAS and the Center for Global Finance as well. So thanks so much for the panelists, to the very stimulating initial comments, and also for the contribution and answering the questions. So thanks so much for being panelists. Let's a big applause, and then. So whilst the panelists are sitting down, then I'd like to take Victor and Hongbo. Can you come and sit here, please, so that we can do closing remarks, and you feel free to do it from the chair here. And so we've come to the end of the conference organized jointly by AERC and SOAS, University of London. So maybe Hongbo, you may want to provide some closing remarks, and then Victor, and then I'll close.
Very much. So, and thanks for the patience. You have been with us for the whole 2 days. So I really appreciate it. Your time, your interest, in this topic, and your support for our event. And I also would like to thank, of course, Dirk, ODI, Angela, who have spent so much time in preparing everything and making this happening, and everything went so smoothly. So I'm really happy to see that. And also AERC, my former colleague, who traveled a long time, and we had a lot of discussion actually about the issues surrounding this topic. But for me, I think I enjoyed very much, and I do not really feel tired even after those very intensive sessions. So if I summarize, I will take home 3 things from the conference. First of all, from yesterday, I like to summarize keywords. So let's take one keyword from yesterday, and that was partnership from the keynote. So for me, this has been around for so long, but for me, I asked myself the question whether or not this partnership is automatically equals to cooperation, given the fragmentation, given the elevated conflicts. So how do emerging market developing economies are going to form this partnership? And that's one thing. Can they really a partner to, let's say, develop the economies and private capitals from developed advanced economies? So I'm going to think more about that. I think maybe people can take this home as well. The second keyword that I summarize is impacting investment and also private capital. We have heard a lot from the morning to, in fact, to here. So I became a little bit optimistic as compared to yesterday. I mean, I have been doubting about that, and whether or not we have, it looks like a lot of bubbles as well. I went to the conferences, meeting people. I asked them, what do you do? And they always tell me climate finance. So, so I'm thinking about this. I will continue to take this home and to think more whether or not we really want to see the result. Why do we put so much effort, time in talking about that, but still SDG, it is going very slowly. So my third summary is about the last panel. Actually, I saw a little bit of interaction between finance, the financial market, and the real economy, which is my background. So I will think more about what are the impacts giving this new fragmentation on the real economy, such as the industrialization process in Africa, and such as like Yuli, my colleague, talked about how to really make the most of domestic financial resources. I think this is maybe true for advanced economy, but for the developing emerging market, they do not have domestic financial resources. So how do we solve this problem? Yes, developing financial system is one way probably. In any case, it's very good because even though I do not have financial resources myself, I can having a better financial system, a more developed financial market, I can attract more from other places. So I will take this to home and to continue to explore a little bit. So I really enjoyed that. I thank everybody who contributed, and including the counselor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hongbo. Victor.
Thank you, Hung, and thank you, Dak. And let me just two quick points. The first is to thank Dak and ODI Global, and to thank Hong and Center for Global Finance at SOAS University of London for making this possible, and thank you all for being able to come and join this discussion on very critical issues of our time. I reminisce and think back to where all this started. I remember a conversation with Dak some years ago when he came to SOAS to take up the honorary professor in global finance with the Center for Global Finance. And we are thinking of, okay, this is what a Center for Global Finance does, and having its radar on developments in global finance around the world. And ODI also in the same field, especially looking at development across the world, is why don't we come together and do something great? And over time, we realized that, of course, ODI was working separately with the African Economic Research Consortium, organizing events together. And of course, Center for Global Finance was working separately with the African Center for Global Finance, with the African Economic Research Consortium. So what we did now, what is happening here, is like solving a simultaneous equation system. Basically, you get two equations and you solve into one. And that is what's happening here. So you have ODI, you have ERC, and you have Center for Global Finance London. I think this is a great achievement, and we should make this a continuous, annual interactions, because that way we can be able to work together, of course, with our network members, including here and those who joined us online, to think about the global issues. The second is just to say this is timely and approaching that way because the African Economic Research Consortium, which is a Pan-African research organization, research and capacity building organization that started in 1888. And Hadley, and you can see some alumni here, including Professor Peter Kwete, University of Ghana. Hadley is there an economist of great substance, either on Africa, who has not been through the ERC. So you can think of the central bank governors, finance ministers, most of them have worked through the ERC since 1988. We are now transitioning into a 10-year strategy, whereby we are looking at the ERC as the hub for research, excellency, and informing policy for new development strategies. And this is where this conversation comes in. We are looking at the global shifting, we are doing new challenges, but also try to be able to provide knowledge and capacity and capacity building and evidence-based strategies for Africa, or the 54 countries on the continent, for their new development strategies, because as the ground shifts, the development strategies will change. Whether you are thinking in terms of energy transitions, whether you are thinking in terms of climate change, whether you are thinking in terms of critical minerals, whether you are thinking in terms of industrial strategies. So last week, the new president of Malawi invited me to comment on the new putting together new government and how to design strategies in terms of revamping the economies and put a new structure. And that's what the ERC does. But the ERC cannot work alone. We work with the Center for Global Finance, we work with the ODI, we work with you as members to try to see where can we bring our minds together and we focus, provide the technical input, the strategies, the direction, new research, policy advice, because all those alumni of ERC that govern the central banks and govern the Ministry of Finance count on us to be able to deliver that. And we can't do it alone. We need to do it with you in partnership. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Victor. And let me just finish with a few minutes reflection as well. I thought this was a very fascinating conference and learned a lot. And also, I think there's a lot more to do in this topic. We've barely touched the surface of this, I think. I think on the one hand, it's a broad topic, broad title, and has allowed us to talk about financing in particular topics in ways that we've done before as well. But perhaps in a slightly different context. But there's also the issue about seeing and looking at geopolitics and geopolitical fragmentation as a research topic in its own right. And I think there we have seen quite a few different remarks being presented. I think, and Marcelo is here, for example. I think you said off the cuff, like interest rates are going to be higher for longer. And if that's a result of the current geopolitical fragmentation, that's pretty worrying, I would have thought, because that will lead to less capital investment, lower growth. And I mean, the OBR here in the UK has just revised its forecast for productivity growth, probably for a different reason, right? For Brexit and so on. But those are real world examples of how in a couple of weeks' time our net income will decline because our taxes may go up, right? You feel it. You feel you could feel the impact of geopolitical fragmentation directly in your purse, basically. And there are lots of other issues, I think. So we talked about the development sector as such. So there were quite some pessimistic keynotes about this is all going to be very different now. And you can sort of say, well, maybe for 5 years it's going to be a bit tricky, and then later on it's going to be a fine. So now we're at about 200 billion ODA, and maybe with some dips, maybe later on it's going to go up again. But I mean, Colin's keynote yesterday was suggesting, well, this is we're in it for this has changed fundamentally, and so we don't know yet whether that's going to how it's going to emerge. But we do need to keep watching this. And the other is, I think we need to be better at sort of thinking much more of the cost and benefits of geopolitical fragmentation. I think the IMF put out a paper that sort of said all the geopolitical the trade wars between US and China, for example, cost the global GDP by about 5% or so. I think that's something we can also perhaps see in finance, right? So because if we can see the impact on global finance being raised, and maybe the cost of finance, excess of finance, and hence the impact it may have on growth could be significant, right? So that's something we do need to highlight. And I mean, I went through all the types of capital flows with my first remark. You had portfolio flows, FDI, remittances, ODA. The only outstanding thing that went up was multilateral financial institutions, I think, but all of them were negatively affected in the current context, and potentially by the new geopolitical fragmentation. So that's something that we do need to analyze in depth in the coming years, and also then the responses to this. And we've heard a lot about different types of responses. And when you said one word was important for you, you mentioned partnership. I just written it down as well. Partnership, I think that came out from yesterday, particularly in the development world. It's important to seek new partners, seek to do different things with the same partners, and thinking much more on this in the future around partnerships. That's been on the substance, so now vote for things. So let me first thank the organizing committee and Angela and Meng and the whole IT team. Let's do a big thank you and applause for the team. Thanks, Angela. Well, thank you to the panelists. And of course, a huge thanks to Victor, Professor Victor, for coming here and for the collaboration, strong collaboration. And I think we found out that we had a chapter it was in the book by Ganesh, I think 23 years ago. So that's we didn't know each other then, but then a year later, I think we met or so. And Hongbo, also thanks so much for the strong collaboration we have between ODI and SOAS, and also my links with the Center for Global Finance. So thank you so much for the very strong collaboration. I also like to thank the audience, and so particularly you who stayed here. We had around 300 people who signed up. So yesterday we had a full room and a lot online. I think now they're more online than here. But I want to thank you in particular for being such a stimulating audience, and the panelists as well. And so all our speeches will be online quite soon. Look at the ODI website, and so you can look back at what everybody said, and that I hope you can sort of as in good partnerships, disseminate the findings, and also just share your thoughts on what you thought, and so to keep this alive. And I'm very much looking forward to the next annual conference, maybe wherever it's going to be. But it was our honor to be hosting it here at ODI. So thank you so much for coming here. Thank you. Thank you.